So can everybody turn their cameras off and go on to mute, please? We are recording this meeting, so if you're not a speaker, if you can turn your cameras off and keep your microphones on mute. And I think we can start, Rosie.
I think we can. Okay, excellent. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming along to this session, Into the Lion's Den. The reason we're here is because for any of you who are working on council local plans and in the process, the examination in public is the end game. It's really what you will work towards. And it's a bit different because at that final stage, you are preparing for one audience only, and it's no longer really the councillors, it's the inspector. And I think for campaign groups for starting out, it feels a bit David versus Goliath, and it's a bit intimidating to think of what you are going to have to face if you haven't been to an examination in public. So we thought it'd be helpful to share some tips with you today. I've been through 2 different examinations in public, so I'll be able to answer some questions as well, which reminds me, if you have any questions during the session, if you put them into the chat, please, and then Martin and I will keep an eye on those, and we will do questions after the speakers. So we'll do all those at the end. So for me, the 3 main things for examination in public were being prepared, keeping focused on all the legal and soundness tests, and teamwork. And I know Caroline's going to talk this, but teamwork, even with your enemies, can be a powerful thing. So to introduce our speakers, first we'll have Caroline Dibden, who is a long-standing campaigner, around 25 years of campaigning, including during that time being a district councillor, does a lot of work for the CPRE in Hampshire. And I'd say campaigner extraordinaire. She's had some very great successes, which she's going to tell you a bit about tonight. So she has been through it and survived. And then we have Naomi, who is Director of Rights Community Action. She's been working in planning and sustainable development for many years. She's a doctoral researcher at Birmingham Law School, and prior to that spent 10 years at Friends of the Earth. Naomi also has experience working in government policy at Freiburg in Germany, which is one of the towns I'm obsessed with, and maybe we'll ask you, Naomi, to do a talk about that one day. But unfortunately, Alex was unable to attend tonight because there's a funeral to go to, so he sends apologies, but I hope between us we can field your questions. So I think that's the introduction done, and hand over to Caroline. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm going to attempt to work around the technology and share my screen. So if Rosie can just tell me that it is going to work when it finally does. Just bear with me while I get the presentation.
Yep. Did you remember to put the sound on, Caroline?
Yep. Just going back to the beginning. Sorry, it should have been at the beginning.
That's fine. We can see that. That's clear.
Right, okay, great. So Into the Lion's Den, tips for local plan examinations. Well, the first thing you're probably wondering is, why did Rosie ask me to talk tonight? Well, these are the local plan examinations that I have appeared at. In fact, it's slightly more than that, but they wouldn't fit on. So I've been going since the early 2000s. There was another East Hampshire one before the South East Plan, but the first one I appeared at was the opening of the South Hampshire Day at the South East Plan, where we were campaigning to try and keep the housing numbers down to 80,000. I appeared at several Fareham local plan examinations where the big issue was a new town, campaigning against 6,000 homes there. In the South Downs National Park examination, we were campaigning to include a large area called the Western Weald within the national park, and to increase windfall sites in the housing numbers. Winchester local plan was also about keeping housing numbers down and avoid taking additional housing from Portsmouth and Southampton. New Forest local plan, well, that was to use the exceptional circumstances of the New Forest National Park to reduce housing numbers in the area outside the park. And then last year, Eastleigh was a campaign against 5,500 houses and a new road right across the River Itchen Special Area of Conservation. And all of those were in person, and then the last one, Havant, this year was a virtual local plan examination where we were trying to campaign to keep housing numbers down again and to avoid several sites which were unsustainable. So the question is, did we win any of these? Well, I'd say we won the South East Plan in that we kept the housing numbers down to 80,000. We held the line for South Hampshire. I think we won the National Park one because a large area of the Western Weald was included when they finally designated the National Park. And the big win, and one only last year, was that the 5,000 home new town at Eastleigh was found unsound by the local plan inspector and was thrown out. So what do we think is a win? Well, all of those had different things. Is it about getting the numbers reduced? Is it about getting a particular site thrown out? Is it about a better spatial strategy, better transport strategy, an alternative site, or getting the whole plan thrown out? Well, I think it's very important to be aware of what you're campaigning for when you're going into the examination, because it will influence and give a flavour to how you speak. Getting a whole plan thrown out, which has just happened in Havant, well, at first sight, you'd think, oh, they won that one. But actually now all we're open to is speculative housing development because Havant doesn't have a 5-year housing land supply. So I don't think I would regard that as a win at all. Okay, so the examination, well, this is how I see it. This is a balance. I see the local planning as that person in the middle trying to balance and keep everything fair. They're fighting on the one hand against people like us who are saying that's a terrible plan. You've got to keep your numbers down. No new roads, no new housing, keep the forests. On the other side, they've got the government saying build, build, build. And they are in the middle. They've just worked for years on a local plan. They're getting to the final stages, getting to the examination, and they're probably exhausted by this stage. On one end of the seesaw, you've got, I mean, this is probably a very nice young man and he's got nothing to do with development, but anyway, it was a free image, so I used him. So you've got lots and lots of developers with lots and lots of money, and they can throw experts and expert reports at the local planning authority and the inspector. And what have we got? Well, we've got people who care, and people who are local, and people who really, really want this to make a good plan for their local place. So the inspector, well, the inspector is appointed by PINS, the Planning Inspectorate, who are based in Bristol, but the examination is paid for by your local planning authority. They say on their website that they aim to act in a way which is open, fair and impartial. And all the inspectors that I have seen do exactly that. They're very, very professional. This year in 2021, they reached a milestone. In the last few years, they've just examined 1,000 local plans with 166 different inspectors, and 3.7 million homes have been as a result of local plans which they have found, they have examined and found sound. So, well, we went back to that balance. You've got one side of the equation, you've got those very, very well resourced and with lots of money developers, and you've got people on the other side. So who do you want with you? Well, let's say you're a campaign group, or you might be a parish council. Who else do you want? Well, there are people who are likely to be like-minded. Wildlife trusts, woodland trusts, especially if there's ancient woodland, badgers, butterflies, birds, fish, rivers, anything that you can think of which would have a significant impact on your side of the argument. And experts, well, there are two ways of getting experts. You might have been able to raise significant funds and be able to pay for somebody to come and help you. You might be able to have somebody local who will do something pro bono. If you have a local university, they might help. Funnily enough, in the Eastleigh local plan, one of the experts who turned out to be one of the most influential people we brought to the table was the world expert on the spawning of salmon in chalk streams that are influenced by sediment runoff. I mean, you literally couldn't have found somebody who was more appropriate to be fighting a new road that was going to lead to sediment runoff into the River Itchen. And it was almost impossible for the local planning authority and indeed the developers to argue against him, because there was no other expert who was that level of knowledge. So that really, really made a difference. And finally, legal opinion. I think it's a two-edged sword, legal opinion. If you've got the money, it's definitely worth asking for legal opinion. You might not want them to be actually sitting at the table with you, because sometimes it's better to be the plucky amateur. And I think inspectors often give more credit and credence to people who are just, if you like, normal people like us saying things than if they have the equivalent of what the developers will have, which is lots of experts and lots of money. In fact, in Eastleigh, what we did was we did have some money. So we paid for a QC time and their junior to go through the arguments with us for a day in advance of the local plan examination. And then on the very first morning, where there were some significant legal issues about habitats regulations, we did have the junior who came just for a couple of hours. And then the rest of it we did ourselves. And I think that probably is more influential than actually having a barrister sitting there on your behalf. But it may be that you require one if there are some very important legal issues. And who else do you want on your side of the table? Well, I found that sometimes you have very unexpected bedfellows. And the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is something that anyone who campaigns in planning would see very unlikely, that CPRE Hampshire, which was me, sitting on the same side of table as Gladman Development. But in this particular place, Gladman, who had lots of little sites, were fighting against the big new town. And because he was actually a planner, he was actually quite useful on that day. I never thought I'd see it before, and I'll probably never see it again. But on that day, he was an ally, and we were on the same side. Having said that, the first step is actually to get invited to the examination in the first place. Although you can ask as part of your submission to your written submission to the local plan, it's actually at the discretion of the inspector, and it will be based on your response to the Regulation 19 consultation. So it's very important to get that right. It's very important to be done in the right way. The Regulation 19 response has to be done in a form which the local planning authority will provide you. It must be based on the tests of soundness, legality, and the duty to cooperate. The National Planning Policy Framework, paragraph 35 says soundness looks at a plan being positively prepared, justified, effective, and consistent with national policy. So you have to frame your argument in those terms, and it takes a little bit of practice to twist what you want to say into the terminology which actually deals with those particular phrases. And don't forget that you can also challenge the background evidence. So you've got your local plan, which is probably 200 or 300 pages, but you've also got a sustainability appraisal, a transport assessment, habitats regulation, and a statement of community involvement. And local planning authorities have to have done their consultation in accordance with their own statement of community involvement. And if they haven't done that, that's a matter of a test of soundness as well. When you see a Regulation 19 form, you think, oh my goodness, what a ridiculous form. That's so unwieldy. But actually, this is what the planning inspectors send out as a model form. So it's no use really shouting at your local planning authority because they're just following the guidance. But it has to be done one form for each policy that you're arguing against. It's very time consuming. So you've got that, you've done your Regulation 19, you've actually been invited to the examination. So what happens next? Well, there will be a programme officer and they'll be appointed. The inspector will choose what questions, and they're normally called matters or issues, they want to ask the local planning authority. And they're really what questions the inspector does not believe has already been answered by the local planning authority in the local plan, and all the people who have submitted their answers to the regulation consultation. So they're things they want to delve into more deeply and give everybody the opportunity to contribute. So the inspector chooses those questions, the local planning authority prepares its answers, as will developers and other interested parties. And you can too, but you have to make sure that your hearing statement, because it's in preparation for the actual examination, refers to those questions and is evidence-based. So you can ask for experts and legal opinion to come and help, and you can ask them to appear at the examination for you, but you will probably only have one seat at the table, so you're hot seating in and out of that table if you've got experts or legal opinion to help you. It's really important to read the local planning authority's hearing statements and also those of your opponents, because that will give you a flavour of what they're going to say and how you can frame your argument on the day to rebut anything. You won't be able to introduce new evidence on the day of the hearing unless the inspector is very kind, and sometimes they are, But I've been at ones where people have waved photographs in front of the inspector and the inspector has said, no, thank you very much. I'm sorry, we're not able to take that evidence. But on other occasions, they say, all right, but you have to, we can't look at it today. You'll have to send copies to everybody else and they'll have to think about it. Interesting, local members of parliament can attend a hearing and they don't actually have to have gone through the process of filling in all the Regulation 19 forms. So quite often I've seen them turn up on the day, make what I would call as a vaguely party political broadcast and go away. But nonetheless, they have the right to do that. So from then on, the main point of contact is the programme officer. You won't actually be communicating with the inspector apart from in the hearings when you're answering questions and making points. There'll be a daily agenda on the table, and it might be slightly different to the matters that has already been issued because those questions might or might not have been answered by hearing statements. So the inspector again will have an agenda where they delve into more detail in the questions that they're going to ask on the day. It's very useful if you can to go and watch another examination. That's very easy now that they're virtual. You just find one that's happening and go and watch. But it is actually useful to see one in action ahead of your own appearance. I've been asked this: do we need a demo? Do we need people with placards and things waving around the examination? Well, I don't think it's ever likely to change the inspector's mind because what they're going to rely on is policy and evidence. But it can set the scene and it might help with fundraising and general publicity. This is just the one on the opening day of the Eastleigh local plan. I'm hoping it will link to it. Bear with me if it doesn't. And will somebody please shout if the sound isn't coming?
They came in coachloads to show the strength of local
Can hear it fine, Caroline.
action against destructive development at Eastleigh and other organisations. It was billed as a peaceful protest, but there was no missing the anger in campaigners at plans for a new development on the outskirts of the town.
It's in the wrong place. It's as simple as that. The furthest location from any possible public transport, such as a railway line. The furthest from any existing shops. The highest quality landscape. The nearest to the South Downs National Park. In every respect on sustainable transport measures, this fails at the very first hurdle.
We're going to need these houses though, aren't we, in the future?
We are. There's no argument at all that we need houses, but they need to be in the right place. And in amongst 7 ancient woodlands and on the headwaters of the River Itchen, frankly, just isn't the place.
This is where developers want to build 5,200 homes on land between Bishopstoke, Fair Oak and Colden Common, with a new link road, schools and shops. It's one of the proposals in Eastleigh's local plan, which considers the future needs of the borough to 2036. The plan is currently being examined in a 6-week hearing by a planning inspector. So that's where campaigners took their fight today.
The main message we want to send to the planning inspector today is that this plan is a plan of the council, not a plan of the people, and that we think it hasn't been thoroughly thought out or researched, and that actually there were better options in Eastleigh. We 100% think that there should be housing in Eastleigh, and we do need more housing, and we completely understand that. It has to be the right houses in the right places.
In a statement, the council said the local plan needs to meet housing need and ensure that vital infrastructure is delivered to help tackle congestion and protect green gaps between our towns and villages. The council has every confidence in its local plan, given it has been through several major consultations. The inspector will hear evidence for and against the proposals before making a recommendation. The planning inspector will read thousands of pages of evidence and listen to hundreds of speakers before making her recommendation. This is just one stage in a lengthy planning process, and for campaigners here, the battle goes on. Mary Stanley, ITV News, Botley.
So, and we did win. The inspector said that the plan for the new town and the new road was unnecessary, which the council hadn't considered. So actually we're now there on the day we've got through the door. It will probably look, I'm just going to change my pointer to look like a laser pointer. So you've got a sort of room with tables around, an inspector sitting at the head of the table here. Probably his programme officer or her programme officer will be sitting off to the side here. One side of the table will be the local planning authority officers, and it may be their legal representatives, and other officers sitting at the back with all their boxes of evidence. One side of this table will probably be developers and site promoters. And you hope, and we hope, that the other side of the table will be people like us and other parish councils, campaign groups, wildlife groups, and people who are campaigning for the countryside. So it always looks slightly similar. This is Mid Sussex. Again, there's the inspector in the middle and the people sitting round. This is Kirklees with the inspector at the head of the table. And the big one here, which was London. So in London here, you have 3 inspectors, and sometimes on big or difficult cases, then sometimes there are more than one inspector, mostly just one, sometimes 2, very rarely 3. So just some little protocol. They still like formality. One calls them sir or ma'am. It seems rather strange, but then you realise everybody in the room is also doing it, and then it becomes second nature. If you want to make a point in the conversation, in real life, what you do is you turn your name card, the one that said Caroline Dibden or Gladman, up on its side, or obviously in a Zoom meeting, you raise your virtual hand. Sometimes dates and times can change at short notice, so just be prepared to change your schedule, which is more awkward, of course, if you've asked experts to appear. But it can happen that things overrun. Generally, well, in fact, in all cases, questions and discussions are led by the inspector. It's not a free-for-all at all. They are there to delve into the detail that they want to examine. So you have to be flexible. You might need to change what you're going to say to fit the line of the argument and how the argument develops. So what you have in advance is what you've prepared that you want to say, but you've got to be able to adapt that as you go along to counteract what other people say against you, or to emphasize what you want. I think it's really important that you agree with your allies and colleagues and don't duplicate points. Even if you're supporting something, it's very, very irking to hear the same thing said again and again. You can say different things or things that complement what you say, but don't duplicate it. And above all, the whole process is not really at all adversarial, or at least none of the ones I've been into. The inspectors have been very polite and very helpful and done their best to enable the public at large to make their points in as clear a way as possible. So after all that, well, the inspectors considered all the points that were made by the local planning authority, by all the written submissions, by all the hearing statements, and what was said verbally. Sometimes in agreement with the local planning authority, they make minor changes as they go along. The odd word or two in a policy can be changed. Sometimes, rarely, the inspector needs and wants more time to reconsider issues, or to ask the local planning authority to go away and do a little bit more work on something, and they will adjourn and possibly reconvene. Contentious issues which might lead to a lack of soundness or legality, which the inspector believes that are resolvable, are called main modifications. Obviously, if they don't believe they're resolvable, then they're going to ask the local planning authority to either withdraw their plan, or they're going to find it unsound. So I think what we all want really at the end of the day is a sound and legal local plan to which we have all contributed, and feel that we were given the opportunity to make our points, and that a professional has listened to us and come up with the right answer. That doesn't always happen, but in all of the ones that I've been to, I have at least felt that I have been listened to. So that's me. There are a lot of links here to useful documents, which of course everybody can pick up when we share this at the end of the day. Very useful one at the end by Friends of the Earth, slightly out of date, but very useful and very easy to read. And some blogs from the Planning Inspectorate about how they see local plans. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'll stop sharing now and go back to Rosie, who will hopefully pass you on to Naomi.
Thank you, Caroline. That was incredibly helpful. I'm wondering if you're able to post all those links into the chat. Is that easy
yes,
to
do? I can do that.
And if anyone wants specific ones, they can take them. Thank you. Okay, so there are a couple of questions, but we'll do those after Naomi. So Naomi, over to you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Rosie, and thanks very much, Caroline. So I'm going to do the boring bit now, I feel, in place of having Alex, the lawyer here, who is at a funeral, which is why he can't be here with us today. But I'm just going to share a bit of that because I think it's actually quite useful to know what the law and the regulations actually state, because sometimes you can get pushback. and I think it's quite important to be able to, I don't know if I can share here. It seems to want me to share my screen, but I presume I can do that, and then I can open my presentation.
Yes, there we go. We can see it.
You can see that? Excellent. Great. Okay. So this is actually a presentation that's modified from the presentation that I used to give as part of the Local Campaigners Guide that Friends of the Earth had on getting involved in local plans. And Caroline's gone through all of it really comprehensively from the point of view of a participant. So I'll just skip over those bits and then focus on the bits where you might be interested in what the regulation or the policy actually says. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about strategic environmental assessment, because I found that very, very useful when talking about policies and alternatives. So it's one of those legal points that can be very helpful. So we definitely need to get involved in the plan process, and obviously with the government thinking about changing, the status of plans, making them shorter, making them quicker to be adopted. All of those things are kind of in the reform process, and of course those things might make it very difficult for us to participate, but plans might become more powerful rather than less. So I think there's many reasons with which to get involved in local plans. And of course, it's the legal first point of a decision. So Section 38 of the Planning Compulsory Purchase Act, the determination must be made in accordance with the plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So we have a discretionary planning system, so that means there is discretion there at the end, but essentially that plan is really, really important in terms of framing that decision. We've got lots of local plans in England, so these can get quite complicated if you're in an area like Manchester, and Marge will know this. You may also be subject to a big spatial development strategy that is doing lots of things that were originally in your local plan and maybe doing different things and more threatening things. So have a look around you at what sort of local plans are going on. And spatial development strategies are a sort of new thing that kind of been introduced through policy rather than set out properly in legislation, and they can be quite powerful because they're used to sort of replace regional spatial strategies, if anyone remembers those. So they're at a kind of higher level. So Caroline talked a little bit about who's in charge. So local authorities will have a plan policy team, but local authorities are also outsourcing this to consultants. Beware of that. I've had that quite a few times where the plan has been outsourced to a consultant or a set of consultants who I always think that it just reduces the quality of the plan that's coming through, because they're not actually in the local authority themselves and don't necessarily have the knowledge that the rest of the planning team might have. The plan policy team is also usually separate to the development management team or the development control team. So there's two different teams normally with the head of planning above. So if you can be friends with your planning policy team, that's a great thing. You've got your planning inspector, obviously, who's a bit untouchable because they have to maintain their distance. And then you've obviously got council members who are heavily involved in leading local plans forward, depending on which council you're in. And you've also got the Secretary of State who can put his oar in if he doesn't like something. And I say he advisedly because it's Michael Gove at the moment. So what is a local plan? It's strategic policies, land allocations and development management policies. So you might be interested in different parts of it, but I think your approach, as Caroline was explaining, might be quite different if you're looking at land allocations, for example, as opposed to development management policies. And I will give an example a bit later of how to change a development management policy. The strategic policies, I think they are easier to change, but maybe less effective in terms of outcome. Caroline might disagree with me on that one, but that's been my experience working on sort of climate change in local plans. The local development scheme, I flagged this up because this is how the local authority is supposed to let you know what it's doing in terms of its development plan. And so the timetable is really important. I find that these are often not kept up to date, or the timetable slips. But the point is that your local planning authority should be producing one. So you should be able to find out what's going on through that. Statement of community involvement. So ask yourself on that, does it help you to know what is going on? Does it allow you to shape decisions? Is there meaningful consultation? Is there redress if something goes wrong? So obviously, local authorities are also publishing these, and it's supposed to be about how you get involved in the local plan. So obviously you might want to, when they are preparing those, you might want to suggest that there's some things that they should do in there to make it easier for you to be involved. Issues and options. Local plans start in this space. Generally, what are the main issues in the local authority area? What are the options? I find this is quite an interesting psychology, because if the local authority planning officers start with this and they start to look at their issues and options, it's quite a good idea to try and get involved at this stage as well, and to just say, because otherwise you find that by the time you get to a draft plan, a lot of things have been funneled in. So if you can get involved in the issues and options stage, these are quite often out for consultation. As you can see here, Cambridge is doing a conversation consultation. So you can get involved in kind of identifying those and putting your view forward on those issues. Then they come up with preferred options. But remember, this is not the end of the conversation, because as I'm going to talk about it a bit later, the point about alternatives is really, really important and very powerful in the plan examination. So even if there is a preferred option that's been put forward, and you can see that's where the local authority is going, that doesn't mean that's the end. It's not the end of the story. Then you've got your draft plan, and this is where it's really important, as Caroline was saying, to object. And to make sure that you do it on the right format. And this is something that I like to remind any planning inspector or planning authority officer that this is actually the law. Section 26, any persons who make representations seeking to change a development plan documents must, if he so requests, be given the opportunity to appear before and be heard by the person carrying out the examination. So that is actually the primary legislation on plan examinations. And in that examination, as Caroline was saying, you can suggest alternative wording for policies. Using the National Planning Policy Framework is obviously really, really important at that stage to try and get what you need through. And just to go back to the representations, this is the regulations. So obviously you've got primary legislation which sits at the top, that's the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act, and then you've got the regulations, and these get amended all the time. But there's basically representations relating to a local plan. So it just basically says about the date, and you may make representations. This is just about the timetabling. Again, all of it is controlled by regulations. So if some of these things aren't done, this is where you can point out that they're required by secondary regulation to do these things. So to specify date, time and place, who's holding the examination, giving 6 weeks notice, all of those things are basically controlled by regulation. This is the model representation form that Caroline was talking about. It's used by, this is the planning practice guidance. And so they've also got advice there to local planning authorities about how they do the local plan examination webpage, because obviously a lot of this stuff is now online, which you can, has advantages, but I think it also has disadvantages when you've got loads and loads of information that you have to get through, and you have to kind of find these documents online somewhere. One of the only kind of policy that is actually also a legal duty is the climate change duty. And this is section 19(1)(a). Development plan documents must, taken as a whole, include policies designed to secure that the development and use of land in the local planning authority's area contribute to the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. So do the policies do that? It's a big question. and the government required the Planning Inspectorate to change their guidance to planning inspectors 4 or 5 years ago now, to ensure that they were actually looking specifically at climate change in their when they were doing their examination. You can also, this is where I'm saying that you can use policy. So you can look at these sorts of policies and then see if the plan has done these or not, and use these references, which is why all the paragraphs have got reference IDs to support your case if something hasn't been done. So if you can find the policy that backs up your argument, it's good to put that in. Test of soundness. So the two things I think that are really useful for campaigners and people getting involved in local plans to know are whether it's justified, and that's all about your reasonable alternatives. Also whether it's consistent with national policy. I've sort of used both of those policies to get changes in local plan policies. These are the questions that are recommended by government. So basically trying to focus representations on soundness and whether it's been covered already in the plan. So you do have to kind of know quite a bit about your local plan to make sure that your objection is as targeted as possible. All local plans must go through an environmental assessment, and this is part of what's called the sustainability appraisal. But the sustainability appraisal has to incorporate, this is European legislation, which is still with us, and it's called the Environmental Assessment of Plans and Programmes Regulation. And this is quite useful when you're looking at environmental issues, because if you look at 4E, it's in the light of other reasonable alternatives. So you're basically ensuring that the local authority just hasn't picked one policy, one direction to go into and is sticking to it thick and thin. You can check as to whether they've actually assessed a reasonable alternative. And it's different. Strategic environmental assessment, called SEA, very confusingly. The Hatchell regulation is called Environmental Assessment of Plans and Programmes, but we all call it Strategic Environmental Assessment, and we all refer to it as SEA. But the reason people are doing that is because you're distinguishing it from Environmental Impact Assessment regulations, which concerns projects, not local plans. So reasonable alternatives. So this is when we were doing the Kent Minerals and Waste local plan. We basically said that the planning authority had failed to identify reasonable alternatives. We raised this as part of the examination, and we said it's unsound if you've done that, and it's in breach of the directive, which I just referred to. And there was no evidence that the local planning authority had given that they had actually considered alternatives. And so we used that to argue with the inspector about whether it was sound. And of course, this is the regulation governing the inspector's reports, and the regulation says that the inspector's report is basically whether the plan is sound. That is what it's all about. So the inspector's report and adoption, they can recommend modifications with reasons, can recommend adoption, can recommend non-adoption. For example, this is an inspector's report where the inspector accepted our modification following the Kent Minerals and Waste Plan. So this was quite, we've got all these things in about water, greenhouse gases. So basically the policy previously had just been, we'll just approve all oil and gas and unconventional hydrocarbon developments. And got it changed to this. So it was kind of quite a lot of information had gone into the policy to kind of restrict as much as possible the activities. And the other thing that happened as part of it was that there was an additional consultation, which is required if you are basically looking at reasonable alternatives again. So that also brings in an opportunity to discuss the policy in more detail. So the Secretary of State can intervene at any time during the examination, take control of the process and direct documents to be withdrawn. This sometimes happens if there are big issues, so green belt. Reporting and monitoring. So there's it's not totally over when it's over, as it were, when the local plan has been adopted, because there's reporting and monitoring and review. So there are sort of very regular reviews that are supposed to be happening, and the local planning authority is able, under the legislation, is able to at any time prepare a revision of a local development document. So if something has gone very badly wrong, campaign for that revision. That's it from me. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Naomi. That's I hope that's given everyone a really good understanding of the process, because you kind of need to know what's coming at each stage so you know how to respond and what to do. I was thinking as you were speaking, actually, that it's interesting on the modifications. We had a sort of a twin track strategy. So we wanted to get a new town thrown out of the plan. In fact, 2 new towns. That was our sort of ultimate goal. We had a backup strategy, which was that throughout the process, we were recommending modifications so that if worst case, the new town did go into the plan, we had as many policies in place to make sure that it sort of made it as undamaging and as sustainable as feasibly possible. So that's also a tag. So there are a few questions. I'm going to start with one for Naomi. It's probably 2 actually, because it's about neighbourhood plans. So one is from Jude. What's the status of an adopted neighbourhood plan when you've got a local plan? And the other, also on neighbourhood plans, from Lisa, is can a neighbourhood plan provide protection for a site that's been included in the local plan? So I wondered if you could say a bit about that, Naomi.
So the first, hello, am I here?
Hi. Can hear you. Yeah.
So the first one about, well, when a neighbourhood plan is adopted, it's supposed to have the same status as the local plan, technically. The problem is that your plans go out of date. So you've got lots of issues with what's up to date and arguments around that. What was the other question, sorry?
It was, can a neighbourhood plan provide protection for a site that's been included in a local plan?
Depends which one was adopted first. So because the neighbourhood plan can't, if it's all about timing. So the neighbourhood plan can't change what is in an adopted local plan.
Okay, thank you.
But if you get your neighbourhood plan in first, well, then you're first, aren't you?
Yep. Lisa, do you want to put in the comments if that hasn't answered your question? You've got more on that. Okay, then one for Caroline. Are you able to share typical QC costs and recommendations? Certainly, I've got some good QC recommendations that I can always email out to people if you need them. But Caroline, over to you.
Well, let's say it's definitely of the order of some thousands for a day for a QC. I'm sure they're all different, but you have to have deep pockets to have a QC, and it would be the order of some hundreds or early thousands for a junior for a whole day. In terms of giving sort of standard advice, I suppose some of the things they say could be used for other purposes, but I think the whole point of going to a QC is that you want their specific advice on that specific issues. But that was the order of magnitude. I think we went to London to their offices because it's cheaper to not pay their travel time. So obviously it was cheaper for us to go to them. And I think we were there all day, and I think it cost £8,000 to have the QC for a couple of hours and the junior for the whole day. So that's the sort of magnitude you're looking at.
And obviously fix the costs with them in advance. Don't let them put you on a clock, because you have no idea what's going on. And we, for example, we had agreed a fixed cost and the clerk didn't know that. And the clerk sent us a horrifically terrifying bill, which we went back to the barrister and said, what's going on? He said, no, that's a mistake. I'd agreed a fixed cost with you. So definitely negotiate with them. Otherwise it can be terrifying.
But I have to say that on some aspects, it's worth having that opinion. But going to a junior is a really good idea, because they not only are cheaper, but they want to prove how good they are by winning things for you. So,
yeah. Okay. For Naomi from Simon, doesn't the use of those dreadful words mitigation and adaptation leave loopholes for site allocation? So it's all very well proving that you've got an alternative, but the council will just say, don't worry, we've put in a really bad site, but we'll mitigate and adapt to everything.
So the mitigation and adaptation legislation that I was showing there is in relation to climate change. That's the section 19(1)(a), which is that planning policies as a whole must contribute to the mitigation and adaptation of climate change.
I see. Okay, so it's nothing to do with the alternatives, and so
No.
it wouldn't give the authorities an opt-out.
No, but it's a really interesting piece of law if you think about, well, are the developments, is the policies that are being proposed as a whole, are they contributing to the mitigation and adaptation of climate change? You know, it's a different way to challenge what's being put forward in the plan.
Yeah, and isn't that also a case that so long as they can say they have considered these things, then they've kind of got a get out of jail free card, or do they have to really demonstrate more than that?
I mean, I would say that they have to demonstrate more than that because the guidance is quite detailed. And the Climate Change Act 2008, it's got targets in it. And, you know, the latest adopted carbon budget order adopted June 2021 is obviously fairly stringent. So you say, well, you know, the policy, the law tells you that plans have to contribute to the mitigation and adaptation of climate change. How do you do that? You look at the policy, and the policy tells you, well, the Climate Change Act 2008 sets out the national carbon budgets for the UK. And then the carbon budget order tells you what needs to be achieved within the window of the plan period. There's your number.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Another question from Simon is probably also to Naomi, I think. Can a submitted local plan be withdrawn after examination if the modifications are considered too onerous by a local authority?
So no, I mean, basically the local authority, they used to have more power in terms of saying we don't want that, but the inspectors got the whip hand, I would say. It's the Secretary of State who actually really has the, you know, he's the one who can really interfere at any point.
What actually might be interesting, so Eastleigh, where the new town was found to be the unsound part of the policy, is that Eastleigh withdrew those two policies. So policy S5, which was we're going to have a new town, and policy S6, which was we need a new road to service the new town. They withdrew those two policies and kept the rest, so that at least they had enough to be going on with to see them through, because I think, you know, the prospect of having no plan at all was worse than even having 3/4 of a plan. So, and the inspector agreed to let them do that.
Okay. Actually, we sort of had the opposite of that situation, whereby after the first examination, the inspector told the authority, he gave them 3 options, but it was pretty clear he wanted them to take the first option, which was to drop the garden communities, the new towns, and to proceed with the rest of the plans. The second option he gave them was to do more work on the garden communities and come back when they'd done it better. And the third was to withdraw the plan, and we all knew that that was a really bad idea. But it was interesting because they kind of ignored the inspector and carried on with loads of work and went back for a second beating at examination, second time round, and then lost. So it's quite wise, I think, to listen to an inspector. Now, question for Caroline from Alistair. He says, if I feel, this is a good one, useful actually, if I feel I've said everything I need to in my hearing statements and at Reg 19 in my consultation responses, how much should I say at the hearings?
Well, you don't need to say anything at all, of course. The only reason for going to the hearing, I suppose, is if you think that on the day the risk is that your opponents who are proposing something that you don't like might swing the day by being there, and that you just need to be there to ensure that there's an opposing voice on the day. So I would say if you can be there, even if you actually just waste the day sitting there in silence, because you might find that there's something really important that needs to be said at that moment. But obviously it depends whether you have the time and ability to do that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. You'll find that although, as Caroline said in her talk, no one's supposed to submit evidence during the hearing, you'll find everyone trying left, right and centre to do so and saying, oh, well, this is exceptional and you really must accept it, nice Mr. Inspector. So there is stuff changing all the time when you're there. So I think, yes, definitely do whatever you can to try and get a seat at the hearing. And to do that, you have to sort of justify to the inspector that you've got reason to be there, and then be prepared to act on a whim and speak at the time. Alistair's gone on to say, I think it's a rhetorical question. Sorry, Naomi, I will come back to you. He says, our plan was developed over several years, with many twists and turns. It was submitted 3 years ago. Since then, the 3 most senior planners have left the council. Have Basildon got a problem? I don't think that's a question for the speakers. I think that's rhetorical. Note, I gather they're using a barrister. Go on, Naomi.
Yes, I was just going to say that I've, in the examinations that I've been in, there is, you usually end up writing the policy. Well, I've usually ended up writing the policy, or the inspector said, well, what form of words do you want then if you're not happy with what the local authorities proposed? So you do need to be prepared to do that. And then there's lots of negotiation that goes on. So definitely think about that, well in advance. And that's sometimes where it's quite useful to have a bit of legal advice beforehand, because they can tell you what the different words mean, because planning is a language with its own dictionary.
Yeah, actually we had an entire day right at the end devoted exclusively to modifications after all the substantive issues have been and talked about, and it was very surreal because we all kind of knew, or we hoped that we were right, that the plan was going to get rejected, and we couldn't see how the inspector could find it sound, but we all had this really surreal day where we sat there talking through literally line by line of the plan and suggesting modifications. So I agree, Naomi, that is the point where it's really useful to have legal input, because it becomes very technical, doesn't it? And every word has a different nuance and different meaning. And you've got barristers quibbling over the different meanings as well. Okay, this is a question from Rebecca, also for Naomi. You mentioned of the Town and Country Planning Act that everyone has a right to speak, but Caroline said, and I know that's how it's worked with us, the inspector chooses who attends. So how do those two match up? Because if you haven't submitted at Regulation 19, with exceptional circumstances, I know you can be allowed to speak, but is it the fact that you could barge your way in and say, look, this is the law, I have to be allowed to speak?
Well, you have to follow the regulation. So, the point is that if you object at the right time and your objection is a valid objection and it's relevant and you have made points that are not going to be raised by somebody else, then you have the right to be heard. So, I mean, that is the law, but then obviously you've got regulations which kind of slightly narrow down, and govern the actual process. But I always quote that. Yeah, because if I've objected at Regulation 19 stage, I go, and I say I want to speak. But then I think it's difficult sometimes, because obviously the inspector is also trying to manage, the process. But yeah, I would use that.
Okay. Yeah, and certainly again we have managed to get people in after Regulation 19 because circumstances have changed or something new has happened. So we've been able to argue to the inspector that it would be unreasonable not to let them attend. So I think the answer there is always speak to the programme officer very nicely. And actually we were advised early on to make friends with the programme officer, because that is your conduit through the system. So ask them questions, be nice to them, praise them for all the hard work they're doing, all that sort of stuff, because they do work hard, and they have quite lonely jobs. Actually, they don't have an office, they don't have colleagues, so they do like to talk to people, and some of them follow it all quite closely, and they're not allowed to have allegiances, but you can tell sometimes which side they're on. So okay, on alternatives, do you need alternatives if you've got 40% over the government allocation built already? Wiltshire Council are adding 5,000 houses on top of their allocation, which we'd like removed. Naomi, that's quite a challenging one for you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Caroline knows more about that than me.
Okay, go on, Caroline. Do you want to try
the expert there.
the problem is the way it says at the moment is that housing numbers are generally a minimum, and that if the local authority wants to go for growth or wants to use housing to justify an increase in funding for infrastructure, then it is at their discretion so to do. So you have to come up with a lot of good reasons why they shouldn't do that. My first one would be electorally. I would hope it would be suicide in somewhere like Wiltshire, but then you never know, do you? So the ballot box is always a good one to start with. But other than that, no, then you're back to evidence-based and the reasons why it would be an appalling thing to do. But they are allowed to do it, and they are allowed to put it in their plan.
They are, and actually there is this presumption in favour of growth as well. So inspectors are unlikely to reject a council that's being good and trying to build more houses. So as you say, you've got to prove it's not sustainable, or that there are environmental constraints, or as Caroline's saying, that there are reasons for those houses not to be in the plan.
And I think that's where you might need demonstrations and posters and placards, because the people who are making those decisions will be the local councillors, and if they want their seats, to keep their seats. So I would say at that point, then it is worth it. But once you've got to the point that it's in a plan and it's in the examination, then you've got to justify it to the inspector on evidence and policy.
Okay, thank you. Question from Steve. Does citing other local plan inspector outcomes and decisions about specific issues in another area help a Reg 19 response if it's a similar matter? I will come on to you two and see what you've got to say, but we had an issue. It was beyond Reg 19. We were in the hearings, and a neighbouring district's inspector's letter had come through literally on the first day of our hearings. So they were very relevant because they were also about garden communities, and the inspector there had rejected 3 garden communities. So it was hugely relevant. And actually the QC working for our local authorities really pushed it with the inspector and kept sort of telling him effectively what to think. And we had an icily calm, superb inspector, poker face. You could never tell what he was thinking, but he was apoplectic with rage by the time this QC pushed him, and we all sat with our heads down, sort of looking at the table, and the QC was told off for pushing things too far. And the inspector said, "This is my examination. I'm examining the plan I have in front of me. All that matters to me is whether the policies in this plan are sound, and none of the rest of it matters." And he said, "I don't want you to refer to that other inspector's decision again, because that has no bearing on what I'm looking at here." However, going back to Reg 19 responses, I think definitely do, yes, because it's setting precedent and giving examples. So I think it's just how you handle it. But Caroline or Naomi, do you want to say anything about that?
No, I agree. I think that at regulation 19 stage, if there's something that's very appropriate and backs up your case, well, yes, use it as evidence. Of course, it's evidence that there, have been cases that are similar. And you can have, some inspectors will allow things that are hot off the press to be allowed, and some won't. And I think Rosie's quite right. It depends where their sympathies lie to an extent. So.
Thank you. Naomi, have you got anything to say on that?
Sorry, no, I'm just responding in the chat box.
Okay, excellent. So Fenella says, can you please share QC recommendations? So maybe Caroline, after this, we can have a chat. Maybe we can work out where we put a list of the people that we've worked with, and maybe with you, Naomi, as well, because obviously you've got Alex as. So we probably do need to do that, don't we? So we'll take that offline and work out how best to share those. Ria says, could we be sent some examples of Reg 19 forms? Yes.
I put the link to that in the chat box, but I presume the link to the actual form, but I presume what you mean is actually examples of people who filled that out. Yes, is that right?
I presume that's right. But still probably useful for people to see the form, because actually it does have an impact on the way you then structure your response once you've seen the form. You don't have to fill in the form either. We never, well, we did the tick box bit, like sort of, do we want to attend the hearing, and the sounders test, unsound or sound or whatever, we did that. But we then, and most of the developers do the same, we then just put an attachment in with our full response. So you don't have to be constrained. I was asked recently about someone filling in a modifications consultation. The first box usually says you can only put 100 words or 100 something. And that's your summary, but you can put in as much as you want. You can put in maps, you can put in attachments, you can hearing statements. You might find the inspector sets a word limit, and that's just because of the amount of time that he has to read them between the submission date and examinations. So you'd be asked to keep those concise, and he will reject things if they're too long and send them back to you. And he will also strike things out if they're not relevant. And inspectors can also not accept documents. They can just say, no, that's not relevant, or I don't want to see that. So so don't feel you have to be bound by the form that you've got. You can say what you want. And the other thing is, if you want to compile other people's responses, we did that. We compiled a spreadsheet where we had everyone's responses for the Reg 19 because it had become so technical and so complicated. We knew people wouldn't be able to fill in the form. So we just said, tell us what you think about the proposals in your own words. And then we just stuck it in a big form. And that meant the inspector got to see at a glance what people thought, but without putting people off because they weren't going to know whether a plan was justified or effective. So you can do that, and inspectors do like sometimes having those consolidated rather than having to have lots of different separate ones. Okay, so another one from Rebecca. Neighbourhood plan, we have 235 houses in the neighbourhood plan at examination, but draft regulation 19 local plan has 2,200 houses, not including the 235. I think that's a statement rather than a question showing the discrepancy. And how the planners put in more houses by a long margin than the neighbourhood plan. Okay, I think, Solmaz, do you have any examples? Do you have any examples of what, or is that the template that you're asking for? Could you, do you have any examples of, oh, sorry, okay. Do you have any examples of the use of failings in a local authority's use of quality assessment of any plan, policy or procedure under Equalities Act? That's an interesting one. Either of you? I haven't.
No, I can't say I've come across that, I'm afraid. No.
We have challenged the well, when I was at Friends of the Earth, we had two major challenges to redevelopments of markets in London, and we used equality impact assessments in relation to that. So
actually, the only thing I'm thinking is that in the Haven't one of the things about their statement of community involvement was that they would put paper copies in libraries for people who were not online. That's not really an Equalities Act, but it is about reaching out to people who are not, computer savvy. And that was one of the reasons the inspector pulled them up, because they said, you said you were going to do this and you haven't done it. So, and they just said, well, it was sort of COVID. And the inspector said, well, I'm sorry, you still said you were going to do it. So you failed to reach out to those people. It's not quite the same, but it's a similar sort of process, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, Lisa Scott, do you have to ask to speak when you submit your comments, or can this be requested afterwards? You technically have to, when you submit your Reg 19, there's a box that you can tick saying, I would like to attend the hearings, then you have to give a reason why. And to be honest, you can just put in that, I'm a local stakeholder with an interest in this topic. That's all it has to be. I can see Caroline's answered that as well. Right, from Andy, what evidence does the local authority need to show to the inspector to demonstrate their consultation has been fair? We have examples where the consultation is merely a box ticking exercise and residents overwhelmingly views against a certain site, which is still contained within the local plan. The local authority justify their position as NIMBYism in order to ignore consultation feedback. Yes, I think many of us will probably have experienced that or feel that. Do either of you two, Caroline or Naomi, want to answer? Evidence for demonstration of local consultation.
Yeah, well, certainly in Eastleigh, they just said you're all a load of NIMBYs, and we had to demonstrate that there were an awful lot of us, and that's why we did have that demonstration. But ultimately, I don't think that was what was going to swing the argument. The argument was that we had some very good evidential basis for why it was a very poor idea from any number of sustainability and habitats grounds. So They may say that, but I think you've probably got to go back to the evidence really to actually swing the argument at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on that, when I was at Friends of the Earth, we did a lot of work over many years to try and improve inspectors' reports on this thing. So they have to actually include a paragraph which talks about public participation. And part of that work was trying to get inspectors to recognise if the plan, you know, hadn't had good public participation, then you've got this real sort of public trust and public interest issue at stake, and that they were, you know, although the problem is there's no specific reference to it in the tests of soundness, which are very dry, and the policy on public participation in the National Planning Policy Framework is really weak, and they have deleted some of the planning practice guidance. I shared that with you, Rosie, didn't I? Where they just basically had deleted the paragraph, which the paragraph previously had said, obviously it's a really good idea to involve the community and this is beneficial, and then it just says deleted. So it's no longer a part of planning practice guidance. So I think it's a really big issue. And I think it's something that definitely, it's one of those areas where I think we've all got to push as hard as we can on it, even if it feels a bit of an uphill struggle. Because if we don't shout about it, you know, no one else is going to shout out about it, and we've got to, you know, we've got to push for what's right in that case.
No, I completely agree. And actually, I know that all the noises coming out from Michael Gover is that he wants to put communities at the heart of everything. So let's hope that is the case, and let's keep pushing that message. The other practical thing you can do if you have time, we didn't realise the importance of this until too late in the process, and also we were too busy doing consultations, but if you end up with a statement of community involvement consultation with your district council at any point, make sure you get involved in it, and you'll think, oh, not another consultation to do. But if you can influence that and make sure it actually has some teeth, that will stand you in good stead, because that is cited at the examination in public. So keep an eye on that, because they need to be renewed, I think, every 5 years. There is a little paragraph in the NPPF. It's a fairly toothless one, but it says something like local plans are supposed to be shaped by the community. So you can throw that back at them. But the community engagement thing's not the strongest part, I don't think, of any sort of toolkit when you're fighting a local plan. It's worth saying, but I don't think it's going to help you to win. David Parish. Does the inspector have to consider developing government policy, e.g. Greenbelt? Either of you?
Actually, I think Naomi started to answer it, didn't you? By saying
sorry,
that.
I'm reading. I'm reading behind.
That's right. But by saying that what they say doesn't really have much teeth unless they put it into a proper official statement, or it makes it down the line into the NPPF. So. Yeah. All of the Prime Minister's recent statements about, you know, we must focus on brownfield rather than greenfield, and all Michael Gove's statements about you can take environmental constraints into account mean nothing yet until they've put it into policy. So we must campaign that they see that through and into the written word, because that's what the inspectors are looking at. Actually, and then that's what local or planning authorities will then have to do, because they will also have to write their plans in accordance with it. So that's my view anyway.
No, I'd agree with that. Okay, would you consider giving a session on fighting a DCO? That's a very good idea. We're fighting development in the Greenbelt, which is being pushed through a DCO and a local authority. Sorry, my scroll isn't working. Local authority abdicating any responsibility for the development and ignoring our opposition. It looks like DCO is more difficult for the little people to participate in. Yes, we should definitely do that. It's a really good idea.
But the DCO process, the Development Consent Order process under the Planning Act, was set up to basically railroad projects through. So the real problem with you know, once things get into the nationally significant infrastructure projects regime is you have a very strict timetable once it starts, and then it's very, very stressful because they're totally inflexible on that timetable. So yes, and I think DCOs are really problematic because they are being used for more and more development, and DCOs basically most of them have been approved. If you look at how many nationally significant infrastructure projects have come through that regime since 2008, it's basically apart from the second one, the Covanta incinerator in Merthyr Tydfil, which was famously the valleys managed to see off the developer. You know, most of them get approved, so they're really tough to fight. But there are quite a few people who are working on them now, because there's some big road projects that are going through DCOs, as well as obviously airport expansion and that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, we definitely should do that. That's an excellent idea. And in fact, there's the government consultation running at the moment on nationally significant infrastructure projects. And I think one of the points of that consultation is to make it even faster and more streamlined, isn't it, Naomi? So
yeah, there's a really big problem, because the devil is in the detail of the regulation. So the regulations govern the process. And I found to my cost that things like when you're having an exchange of written evidence, which is, it's basically more written and only issue specific hearings for things that the examiners feel is important. So the exchange of written evidence has no deadlines or timings. So you can get a series of questions through from the examiner, and it's just like, well, you need to respond within a day. There is no, like, you don't get 7 days to respond. It's really, really difficult. So, and all of that stuff is in secondary regulation, and all of that stuff can just go through, and nobody really knows when all of these little rules and regulations are being changed, but then they impact massively our ability as lay people to get involved.
Yeah, okay. No, I think that's a good point. We need to be on our toes on that one. And actually, we've got a meeting coming up with Friends of the Earth, who are quite involved with NSIPs and have been asking people for feedback, and that will go into their consultation response. So there'll be quite a lot we can learn from that. Marge is saying that her local authority have told us there's no requirement for them to involve communities in the updates to the statements of community involvement. Well, that seems to be a bit of a making mockery of the system, doesn't it? Do you know anything about the... Yeah, I don't know about the legalities of that. That might be. Do you know anything, either of you two, about that?
As far as I'm aware, they removed the obligation to consult. Happened about, I think, quite a while ago, maybe 6 years ago, but nobody really noticed because it was a tweak. But it's a tweak with impact.
Okay, there you are, Marge. That can go on our list for campaign for as well.
I did write an objection, Marge. It didn't get very far.
I mean, I think just one point on that is there's two issues. One is the, you know, what's in the regulations, and yes, they've removed that particular clause, but morally, a local authority should be looking at involving communities in the statement of community involvement and any updates to it. So it is quite interesting that they've chosen to deliberately exclude. We've had ours updated 3 times, and communities have been excluded from the updates each time. So, yeah.
Okay, that's pretty bad, isn't it? So we can definitely try and lobby on that one. Right, I think we're nearly getting to the end of the questions. So there's one here from Mel. Wiltshire Council say the road will reduce congestion, and when you dig, it is because we will use cars less in the future. That's a crazy statement. How can they get away with things like this in their frequently asked questions? Well, I guess probably Naomi and Caroline are both going to say it's only a frequently asked question. It's not in policy. It's not a legal document. It's just presumably on their website. Would that be what you'd both think?
Yes, I mean, you could, when it comes down the line, I suppose the point you can say is they said this, and what evidence did they have to back it up? Actually, in the chat, I've put a link to a really good report done a few years ago by CPRE, along with the Campaign for Better Transport, about the kind of myths of new roads, and that it actually, history shows that it increases traffic. So I suppose the only thing you can do is rebut whatever they say with evidence. And that was a really good report. So hopefully that might help you.
Yeah, that looks useful, actually. And that's right, to be honest, just literally stick to evidence, particularly as tonight we're talking about the inspector. It's all sort of facts and evidence. And if they've made statements that don't make sense, tell the inspector, because that makes their plan undeliverable if it's based on nonsense. Right. Okay, just scrolling down. Sorry, my computer's playing up. Does anyone have any idea when Gove's review might result in policy change which will impact local planning? I worry it will take an age and will be prioritising levelling up policy, which is understandable. Yeah, it looks like, I don't know if that's prompted by the news today and yesterday, but it looks like that will happen next year. And it's going to be a planning and levelling up bill, probably introduced around about the Queen's speech, which I don't know if you both heard the same. That's certainly what I've been seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I've just had a letter back from the department saying they are planning to review the NPPF in relation to climate change, but unspecified date.
Okay, yeah. Yes, and Simon's also put suggestions in today. So yeah, we think probably early next year and spring. Julian, chain authorities are always producing new draft policies or referring to emerging policy. How much can they rely on this in a local plan? Either of you?
I think it depends at what, if you like, level of weight the emerging policy is. So as we sort of said earlier, until it's actually part of the NPPF, I think it probably carries little weight. We went to a presentation the other day on, you know, the ramifications of what politicians say and how important they are, and the answer is, well, they're not very important until it actually becomes part of the, you know, official legal framework. So at some point, local planning authority has to say, well, this is the point at which we're going to submit our plan. And at that point, obviously, then, not that it becomes set in stone, it obviously doesn't, but they have to draw a line under what keeps on coming out from government at that point. So things do, because these things take so long, they appear to be always out of date. I suppose that's one of the frustrations of the whole process, that at whatever point you do it, there's always something which means you should have updated it. So you just have to kind of go, yes, this is the point at which we're stopping and moving on now.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that the changes to the National Planning Policy Framework in terms of 5-year housing land supply basically constantly put that policy out of date. So you've just got very uncertain policies because of that introduction. So prior to that, you know, your policy held for a bit longer, but now that's just opened the gate to kind of arguing that a policy is out of date almost immediately. But, you know, I've been in you know, appeal hearings and bespoke inquiries, and we've used quite old planning policy because it's adopted and it's still in line with the National Planning Policy Framework, and, you know, a new draft plan which has you know, only gone out for one round of consultation wasn't considered to have as much weight as the existing plan policy, which was in conformity. So, you know, as the plan goes through a process, it's accruing weight all the time. So the closer you get to the end, the more weight it has. But that's something that lawyers love to argue about in hours, endlessly.
That's true. In fact, I was reading an appeal decision today. So in Braintree, they started our current local plan at the end of 2014. It was supposed to be adopted early 2017. It won't be adopted before spring next year. And so we're still relying, even though we've got a plan that's been examined by an inspector awaiting a decision. So you'd think that'd be a pretty well-developed plan. The appeal letter said, no, I can't rely on that. So they're relying on the really old one. So you're absolutely right. They do have sort of levels of how much your plan is emerging and how much weight they can give it. Right, I think this might be the last question. Does Natural England have the final say on the soundness of habitats regulations assessments? Oh, it's just dropped on my screen, sorry. This was a key weakness in a challenge of the London plan. So does Natural England have a final say on the soundness of the HRA assessments?
That's probably one more for Naomi. I think probably the inspector is supposed to be able to make a judgment on that, but in my experience, Natural England are very poorly resourced and don't seem to have much time or manpower to put behind any particular local plan, even the London one probably. But certainly we had the issue here in the with nitrates in the Solent impacting all of the local plans, and Natural England could barely send anybody to the examination. So the inspector had to make a judgment on their own sort of interpretation of what Natural England has said in the past. So I don't think I can answer that, Caroline. Naomi may have a sort of more legal view on it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Caroline. I think the lack of evidence is the really big problem, because you'd have to challenge the challenge the conclusions that have been drawn under that. But I was more thinking about, if they haven't done the assessment properly, that's a very fruitful area for challenge, because it's a procedural. There's quite tight procedure that has to be followed, and if those procedures have not been followed, that's when you go into judicial review. So you challenge on the basis that it's a procedural challenge. And habitats and environmental impact assessment are both very fruitful areas for challenge, because there's basically quite strict procedures that you have to follow, and also environmental assessment plans and programs. That's the one I mentioned before. Again, you can point out that there are very strict things that are required to be done by the authority, and if they've not been done, then you need to go back and do them. And judges are sort of okay with upholding those points when they can see that it might have had an impact on the outcome.
Okay, thank you. So question from Julian. In one local plan, we found it useful to point out inconsistencies in past behaviour by a planning authority. Do you think this is worth raising in a statement? Well, that's an interesting one. Naomi, have you got any thoughts on that?
Sorry, I was just answering another question. So what was the question? Which one are we looking at?
The inconsistencies in past behaviour by a planning authority. Do you think it's worth raising in a statement?
I don't know. Caroline might be more interested in this one, to be honest. I mean, if you have to think about it, in a plan examination, what you are doing is you are discussing the strategic policies, the land allocations, and the development managed policies that are being put forward, and you're basically trying to change those. So you are suggesting alternatives, and if the inconsistent behaviour in the past, what you might be able to say in those terms, which might be useful, is that there's no, there was a position taken before, it was evidenced, it was reasonable, etc., and then suddenly it's been changed, but there's no evidence being given for that, there's no due process being followed. So I think you'd have to look at that a little bit more, rather than just looking at inconsistency in behaviour. Just have to actually have a look at what they've actually done, and use that, without knowing the actual case. I would say just use that to expose, the fact that something hasn't been done properly. There's a procedure that's not been followed. There's an alternative proposal that has not been considered.
Yeah, and you could use, maybe I was thinking about housing delivery, because they'll be arguing how much housing they can deliver at what pace and what they've done previously. So you could say, look, there's no way you can deliver X houses a year because you've never done it before. So you can go back at the evidence of things they haven't achieved, can't you? So I think as long as it's all based on evidence, it's fine, and relevant, it's fine to do that, but not maybe sort of raking through the mud. Carol, are you about to speak? Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I suppose it's a bit like in a court case where you have to look at the evidence in front of you of whether somebody's guilty or not, and not whether they've done 5 previous crimes in the year before that, unless that's sort of symptomatic of a behaviour and can be used to help justify the case that they've done something procedurally wrong. So I suppose it's about laying the groundwork. But I think you probably still have to look at the case in front of you rather than what they might have done in the past. So hopefully you did find it useful, because it set the scene for undermining their expertise, or undermining their credibility, I suppose.
Yeah, but exactly, not doing it based on evidence. Ria's asking, how do we find out about our local plan status, where it is at in its review? That should all be on your local authority page. So if you just literally do a Google search for your local authority and put local plan, it should take you into their pages, and then they should every local authority, or whatever level yours is at, should just have your local plan status there, and you'll be able to read what's been done, what consultations have been held, and what's next. So if you can't find it, maybe let us know, because that would be a bit odd.
Rosie, there was a question from Charlie Keeling about the Sevenoaks and Tunbridge plan and the duty to cooperate.
Yes.
Sorry,
Do you think the
that one?
ministers? No, I haven't actually. I was just. Do you think the minister's new approach is positive or a negative thing for them? So I presume that means the minister's new approach to community involvement I was mentioning earlier, or maybe it's the duty to cooperate, which was going to be removed, wasn't it, under the planning for the future last summer?
Yeah, but at the moment it's still there. So
yeah.
I think that at the moment it's just a minister's new approach and hasn't made it through. So the question is, was it just him making a political statement that won't actually then see the light of day?
Yes, exactly. I think that's
but yes,
jury's out, I think.
If he goes through with it and the duty to cooperate is taken away, then I suppose they could it would be good for them.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that was the last question. And as it's just approaching 9 o'clock, that was perfect timing. So I think we'll draw it to a close. And a huge thank you to Caroline.
We do
Oh,
have,
go on, Marge, sorry.
We do have one hand that just was raised, although it's gone down again. So Dave Toms, do you want to ask something? You need to come off mute, Dave.
Yes, just a quick one, and that is, how would an inspector view deliberate lies in evidence?
Either of you?
I guess it's, can you demonstrate that it was a lie, and how you phrase it. I think if you phrase it in a way that there's a legal issue and that it hasn't complied with it, then that's probably the way to go about it, because just calling somebody a liar isn't going to win your argument unless you've got all the pieces of paper to back it up.
Yeah, I think the main thing is to be super professional, isn't it, Caroline, at these hearings, because it is literally all about, it's quite dry, it's kind of, it literally is about the details of the evidence. And yes, if someone has lied, that needs to be pointed out, but in a really professional way. They don't take kindly to sort of slurs and kind of anything that's pointing at bad behaviour. They don't like that sort of thing, do they? They want it all to be very much about planning. So it just has to be done tactfully. Okay. Right. So thank you, Caroline. That was a superb practical tour of what to do in preparing for a local plan examination. And thank you, Naomi, for all the sort of legal basis, which is really helpful for people to know what they're facing. And thank you to everybody for all your comments and questions in the chat. So I have just literally put in one of the last chats that my email. So people who wanted barrister QC recommendations, if you want them quickly before we get a proper list together, then email me and I can send you some, or Caroline can send you some. So thank you all, and good night.